Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today, Wayne reads Where the Buffalo Begin. Always remember that as we go through these amazing adventures and read these outstanding stories, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link in order to follow along with the words. Now I think that Ozzy will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Now that Ozzy's here, let's jump in. Where the Buffaloes Begin. Over the blazing campfires, the wind moaned eerily through the thickets of juniper fir. They spoke in the Indian tongue of the strange lake to the south, whose waters never rest. The Nawa, a wise man who lived in such countless moons that not even the oldest member of the tribe could remember when Nawa was not old, declared that if you arrived at the right time on the right night, you would see the buffaloes rise out of the middle of the lake and come crowding to the shore, for there, he said, was the sacred spot where the buffaloes began. It was not only Nawa who declared that the buffaloes had their beginnings beneath the water and were born in the depths of the lake. Indian legend, far older even than Nawa, said the same thing. Nawa was the only voice that kept the legend alive. Often in the winter, when the wind drove with a roar over the prairies and came a thundering crack up the creek, making the teepee shudder and strain, Little Wolf would listen to the wind and think about the stampede of the buffaloes. Then he would snuggle warmly under the buffalo robe that was his blanket, and he would be thankful for the shelter of his home. And sometimes he would go very far down the shadow ways of sleep and would meet the buffaloes as they came up from the lake, with the water shining on the shaggy coats and their black horns gleaming in the moon. And the buffaloes would begin by being very terrible, shaking their great heads at him, as if they intended to kill him there and then. But later, they would come up close and smell him, change their minds, and be friendly after all. Little Wolf was only 10 years old, but he could run faster than any of his friends, and the wildest pony was not too far wild for him to catch and ride. But the great thing about him was that he had no fear. He knew that if an angry bull bison or pack of prairie wolves had ran him down, there would be nothing left of him but his bones, and he was well aware that if he fell into the hands of the people's enemies, the bisons, he would be killed and scalped as neatly as he could be. Yet, none of these things terrified him. Only being wise for his age, he had clear understanding that, for the present, it was better to keep out of their way. But all the thoughts that ran this way and that in his quick brain, the one that galloped the hardest was the thought of the great lake to the south where the buffaloes began. And as the days lengthened, he could smell springtime in the warm blowing air, and the thought grew bigger and bigger in Little Wolf's mind. At last, it was so very big that Little Wolf could not bear it any longer, and so one morning, very early, before the village was awake, he crept out of the teepee and stole along below the junipers, tall firs, till he came to the spot where the ponies were hobbled. The dawn was just beginning to break, and in the gray light, the ponies looked to the dark blotches along the creek. But Little Wolf's eyes were very sharp, and soon he singled out his own pony, because it was a whitefoot and white patch on his left side. Little Wolf spoke, calling softly to the animal whinnied in answer, and allowed itself to be caught. Little Wolf unhobbled the pony, slipped on the bridle he had brought with him, and leaped lightly onto its back. A few minutes onward, horse and rider had left the camp behind them and were out on the prairie, galloping due south. When the sun rose, they had traveled far. Little Wolf's eyes constantly swept the immense horizon, searching for danger moving in half-concealed ambush. Far off, just on the ridge of the sight, there was a dim spot on the yellowish gray of the prairie. Little Wolf reined his pony to watch to see if it moved. If it did, he crept slowly. He had decided that it was a herd of antelope feeding, and that it was nothing to fear. On he went, hour after hour, never ceasing to watch. The prairie grouse got up almost out into the pony's feet. Larks and sparrows filled the air with their singing, and everywhere wild roses were in bloom. It seemed as if nothing but peace would ever find its way among these singing birds and flowers. Yet Little Wolf knew all well that his enemies, the Assiniboines, could come creeping along the howls of the prairie like wolves, and that there is no moment more dangerous than when there is no hint of danger. At this time, he had not seen a single buffalo, but he told himself that this was because the herd had taken some other way, and that he would probably not see them until he was near the lake. He lost sight of the shadowy spot that had been far away. If he had known that it was a party of Assiniboines on the way to his village, he would have thought twice about continuing to the lake, and would probably have returned along to the trail to warn his people. But his head was too full of the singing of the birds and ringing of the roses, and above all, of the great thought of buffaloes fighting below the lake. It was late in the afternoon when at last he sighted the lake. It lay a gray sheet with a glint of silver glimmering under the sun. Little Wolf looked eagerly on all sides for any sign of the buffalo, but far and wide the prairies lay utterly deserted, very warm, still in the white shimmer of the air. As he drew nearer, however, he saw trails, many trails, going in one direction and leading towards the lake. Antelope and coyote, wolf and buffalo, all left traces behind as they went to the water and returned. But it was the buffalo trails that were the most numerous, most marked, and Little Wolf noted them above the others. When he was quite close to the lake, he dismounted. Hobbling the pony, he turned it loose to graze. Then Little Wolf lay down behind some tussocks, above the low bank of the edge of the river, and waited. From this position, he could overlook the lake without being seen. He gazed over its glimmering expanse, very still now, under the strong beams of sun. It was disappointingly still. Little Wolf could not possibly imagine that buffaloes were struggling underneath. Nor was the movement and the mysterious murmur which Nala had spoken. But Little Wolf was not impatient. He could afford to wait and listen for hours if need be. The time went on. Slowly the sun dipped westward, and the shadows of the grass grew longer. The lake crept its outside stillness, and nothing happened. At last, the sun reached the horizon. It lay there for a few moments, a great ball of flame, then sank out of sight. Twilight fell, and all over the vast wilderness crept a peculiar silence, like a wild creature stealing from its lair. Far in the west there lingered a strange orange light that belongs to the prairie skies alone when the sun is down and the night winds sigh in the prairie grass. Little Wolf could not tell whether it was the sighing of the wind or not, but there came to him along the margin of the lake a strange low murmur that died away and rose again. As the night deepened, the low sound grew. Little Wolf was certain now that it was not the wind, but a murmur that came from the center of the lake. For hours he lay and listened, but the mysterious murmur never ceased. Sometimes it went a little louder, sometimes a little softer, but it always was plain to hear. A wonderful and terrible thing in the silence of the night. As Little Wolf lay watching under the stars, the words of Nala kept singing in his head. Do you hear the noise that never ceases? Is the buffalo fighting far below? They are fighting to get out upon the prairie. They are born below the water, but are fighting for the air. In the great lake in the Southland, where the buffaloes begin. Suddenly, Little Wolf lifted himself up. He could not tell whether he'd been asleep or not, but the lake he saw wonderful sights, the buffaloes. There they were, hundreds and hundreds of them, rising out of the water. He could not see the surface anymore. Instead, he saw a lake of swaying bodies and heads that shook, and their horns and heads tossing the water, gleaming in the moonlight, as it had done in his dreams. Little Wolf felt the blood run along his body. He clutched the prairie grass, crushing it in his fat hands, and staring his eyes drank the great vision, and not only with his eyes, but his ears and his nose, for his ears were filled with the trampling snore they heard and the flash of water as it moved their hooves, and his nose inhaled the sharp, moist smell of the great beasts as they crowded in on one another. The smell the wolves know well when it comes drooping down the wind. Little Wolf never knew what came over him, the spirit of the wild whispering in his ear, but suddenly he leapt to his feet and cried out, and when he cried, he flung his arms above his head, and then he cried out again. And as the first cry, a shiver passed through the herd, as if they were one beast, and the buffalo threw up their heads and listened, absolutely still. Above the margin of the lake they saw, in the white lights of the moon, a little wild boy making swift motions with his arms. He seemed to speak with his arms, to talk to them with the ripple of his muscles and the thrust of his fingers in the air. They had never seen such a sight before. Their eyes fastened to the boy excitedly and shot through sparks of light. And when he cried out again, there swept through stillness of the herd a stir, a movement, a ripple that Little Wolf could see. But the ripple became a wave, and the wave became a swell. It was a swell of buffaloes on the outskirts of the herd and broke along the margin of the lake in a terrifying roar. It was a wonderful sound, the roar of the buffaloes on the edge of the stampede. It rolled out along the prairie in the hollow of the silent night. Wandering wolves caught it, threw their long noses to the wind, and howled in answer and cried. It was the hour when on the lonely prairie sound carries an immense distance, but the ears that might have learned, the quick ears of the Asabinian people, did not catch it, for they were too far away. On moccasins noiseless as the padded feet of wolves, as intent and almost more cruel, the painted warriors were steadily approaching the camp of Little Wolf's people, before the dog star faded in the dawn. But now the buffaloes received the strange message that the Indio boy waved to them on the margin of the lake. Little Wolf did not understand this message. He had cried out to the buffaloes because he could not help himself, because he had loved the creatures of his dreams. But when they saw him and heard their answer, When they came surging out of the lake in a mighty flood, bellowing and stamping across their heads, a wild excitement possessed him. For the first time in his life, he knew the meaning of fear. Swift as the wolf for whom he had named, he darted towards the pony. He unhobbled it and leapt onto its back took but a moment. Then he was off, riding for his life. Behind him came the terrible sounds of buffaloes as they swept out of the lake. Little Wolf threw a quick glance back to see which way they took and saw the dark surging mass heave itself onto the prairie and gallop due north. Little Wolf tried to escape the middle rush of the herd by turning the pony's head slightly westward. Once the buffaloes surrounded him on all sides, he did not know what might happen. If the pony had been fresh, Little Wolf could easily have outstripped them, but after a long day of riding, the animal was tired, and it was going at half its usual speed. Little Wolf glanced again over his shoulders. The buffaloes were gaining. He cried out to the pony, little short cries that made a wild note to the night. As they swept along, the leaders of the left flank of the herd grew close that Little Wolf could hear them snorting sound of breath. Then they were beside him. The pony and the buffaloes were galloping together. Yet they did no harm to him. They did not seem to have any desire but gallop on into the night. Soon Little Wolf was completely surrounded by buffaloes. In front, behind, and on both sides of him, a heaving mass of buffaloes billowed like the sea. Again, as he had cried out beside the lake, a wild feeling of excitement seized him, and he felt his blood stir among his scalp. And once again he shouted a cry, a long, ringing cry, flinging his arms above his head, and the buffaloes replied, bellowing a big answer that rolled like thunder along the plains. Northward, the great gallop swept along the hollows, over the swells of the prairie, below the lonely ridge, with their piles of stone that mark where Indians leave their dead, crashing through the alder thickets beside the creeks, and through the shallow creeks themselves, churning the water into a muddy foam, and the mighty herds rolled on its way. In the thunder of its coming spread terror far and wide. The antelopes were off like wild, the badgers and coyotes sunk into their holes. Even the wolves heeded the warning, vanishing shadow-like along the hollows to the east and west. Little Wolf was beside himself with excitement and joy. It seemed as if he too were a member of the herd, as if the buffalo adopted him and he had been made into their own. Suddenly, he saw something ahead. He could not see clearly because of the buffaloes in front of him, but it looked like a band of men. They were not mounted, but running swiftly on foot, as if to regain their ponies. At first, Little Wolf thought they were his own people. He knew that by the outline of the country that the camp could not be far off. But then he saw that the men were not running towards the camp but away from it. Very swiftly the thought flashed on him. The Assiniboines were the deadly enemies of his tribe. They must have left their ponies some distance away in order to approach the camp unseen, though through the long grist the attack of Little Wolf's people as they slept. Little Wolf knew well that unless his enemies reached their ponies on time, the buffalo would cut off their retreat. Once the great herd hurled itself upon them, nothing could save them from being trampled. He saw the Assiniboines making desperate efforts to escape. He cried shrilly, hoping it would excite the buffaloes even more. The buffaloes seemed to answer their cry. They bore down on the fleeing men with a terrible gallop, never slacking speed. One by one, the Assiniboines were overtaken, knocked down, and trampled underfoot. Suddenly, Little Wolf's pony went down too. The boy leapt clear as the animal fell. By this time, they were on the outskirts of the herd. But before Little Wolf could get to his fallen pony, the last buffalo had passed. The pony struggled to his feet, trembling but unharmed, and with his arm around its neck, Little Wolf watched the herd disappear into the night. Over the blazing campfires, when the wind moans eerily through the thickets of juniper fir, they still speak of the great lake to the south where buffaloes, but now they always add the name of Little Wolf to the legend, for he is the boy who led the buffalo and saved his people. Oh wow, that was a really fun story with Little Wolf. What did you think, Ozzy? That's right. He could have been your cousin. We'll see you on the next adventure, okay? And we'll see you on the next adventure, here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye.